Hello, and a warm welcome to Day 5 of Tamil Heritage Trust's Indology Festival. We hope that you're enjoying all the programs of this week-long festival, and we look forward to your continued participation for the rest of this event. Before we start today's program, I'd like to introduce Tamil Heritage Trust and its activities. Tamil Heritage Trust is a heritage organization functioning primarily in Chennai for the last 10 years. Mission of Tamil Heritage Trust is to provide a platform to understand, appreciate, disseminate, and celebrate the rich cultural heritage of India. Towards this, we conduct several programs and events. Our monthly talks provide a good platform for both serious heritage enthusiasts and experts to share their ideas and insights on a wide range of topics that are pertaining to Indian heritage. The topics could vary from art, architecture, sculpture, music, literature, and so on. Anything that falls under the realm of Indian heritage. Another important aspect of Tamil Heritage Trust's programs is the Interns Workshops that we offer for the general public. We conduct various workshops for the public, including workshops on temple appreciation, workshops on museum appreciation, Indian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Pallava Grantha, and so on. Tamil Heritage Trust also organizes tours, study tours to Mamallapuram that are curated by trained docents from THT, and these tours are aimed at giving deep insights into the cultural heritage and the treasures of Mamallapuram. During the month of December, when it is Kacheri season in Chennai, Tamil Heritage Trust offers a 2-day seminar called Pechu Kacheri, which is a series of lectures around a central topic. Another feature of Tamil Heritage Trust's activities is the annual site seminar or a heritage study tour program that we organize. Every year we pick a heritage monument or a heritage site within India, and months before the tour, we spend a lot of time preparing for it, preparing detailed presentations on it, and we also ask the participants to act as a guide at the site. This year, Tamil Heritage Trust also instituted the THT Professors S. Swaminathan Award. This is to recognize individuals who have done exceptional contributions towards dissemination, understanding, and preservation of Indian heritage. With this Indology Festival, Tamil Heritage Trust is making an attempt to bring together experts in the field of Indology, not just from India, but also from abroad. As you can see, we have a great lineup of speakers through this week-long festival. Today's program is going to be a little different. On the previous days, you saw 2 speakers every day. Today is not going to be lectures. Today we are going to have a panel discussion. We're going to have a panel discussion with our panelists, Dr. Chithra Madhavan, Vikramjit, Rooprai, Aniruddh Kanisetti, and Reena Puri. We also have a series of contests that we are organizing around this festival. So if you're interested in writing about heritage or heritage blogging or taking videos about heritage monuments, you might want to check out the contest that we have on our social media page. We will announce the winners of these contests towards the end of the festival. With that, I'd like to introduce today's program chair. The program chair for today's panel discussion, Taking Old India to Young Indians, is Ashwin Prabhu. Ashwin, after receiving degrees in engineering and management, worked in the banking, financial services, and e-commerce industries for nearly 10 years. A deep interest in education led Ashwin to a 5-year stint as a teacher in a Krishnamurti school in Chennai, where Ashwin taught English and history to middle and senior school students. Ashwin enjoys working with young people, reading non-fiction, and volunteering for not-for-profit organizations in the areas of heritage and fitness. Ashwin is currently working on a non-fiction book on education in Krishnamurti schools. Ashwin is also an active volunteer at the Tamil Heritage Trust and is involved in organizing several programs. I'd like to now hand over to Ashwin, who would take the program forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore, for that lovely little introduction. And good evening and welcome to all our viewers. We are on day 5 of the Tamil Heritage Trust's Indology Festival. My name is Ashwin Prabhu, and I will be your program chair for the day. As Kishore would have explained in his introduction, in day 5, we see a departure from the previous 4 days of the festival. On the last 4 days of the festival, you would have seen 2 speakers each talk on specific themes allotted for the day for a duration of 2 hours, along with an audience Q&A. Today is going to be somewhat different. Today we will be joined by 4 speakers who are all experts in the fields they work in for a panel discussion on bringing old India to young Indians. The plan of action for today is as follows. We will start shortly with an introduction to the panel discussion, the panelists, and dive into the discussion itself. But what's going to make this discussion truly unique, engaging, and participative is you, the audience, asking as many questions as possible. So for all of you out there on YouTube who are watching and want to participate in this conversation, please do type in your questions in the chat box there, and those questions will get routed to us here in the studio. And the panelists are going to try their best and see how they respond to these questions of yours. So on that note, let me start the evening's proceedings. And perhaps the best place to start is by me trying to unbundle the topic for the panel discussion today. The topic, as you all know, reads thus: bringing old India to young Indians. Let me start by saying that we live in exciting and what may well be unique times today. Let me try and explain why. I think on one hand, what we have seen over the last 3 decades or so is a national economic resurgence. And coming on the heels of nearly half a century of tepid economic growth and dormancy, thanks in part to conservative policy making and a closed economy. The fact remains, though, that this economic success and ascendancy which we speak of has not trickled equally down to all sections of society. Nevertheless, as a nation on the global stage, India finds itself today being viewed by all countries as a future powerhouse of potential and viewed with some regard. So we see this movement happening on one side. On the other hand, in a somewhat parallel twin kind of movement, we see a simultaneous rise in the penetration of technology over the last decade or so. And when I say technology, I speak specifically here over both internet connectivity and mobile telephony. What one has seen as a result of this is the breaking of several barriers of access to information, to knowledge, and even entertainment. And I think I would be right in saying that this has happened in a somewhat more distributed fashion than the former economic trend which I spoke of. So we have both of these things happening and overlapping somewhat simultaneously. I think what this has resulted in is speaking for the citizens of this country with a specific focus on history itself. I think more Indians today have access to Wikipedia. They have access to good quality research papers on archive.org, and the gates to a vast selection of books on popular history and historical fiction by writers who operate in genres of both fiction and non-fiction. And I speak of the Amishas, the Devdutt Patnaiks, and the William Dalrymples of the world. All of this has now become available to a large mass of Indians. And this information is available in both digital and paper forms. Now, this information deluge, which is really where I've arrived at, has been responded to in different ways by different people. There have been some who have thrived in this and have chosen to, let's say, enroll in online courses at, say, a Coursera, or participate in online workshops. They've chosen to follow research scholars and experts on Twitter and wade through research archives, all of which are freely available online. On the other hand, some others have been quite happy being part of what one may only call the dreaded WhatsApp university, and have succumbed to this forwarding generation culture, which we so starkly see today. What has all of this resulted in? All of this has resulted in maybe an age of information where there is lots of good quality research material available, but existing along with it are also troves of misinformation. And in the midst of all this churn which the nation is going through, there's a current generation of confident and self-assured youth of the country who are seeking a distinctive cultural identity of their own. Most importantly, this quest for identity is being played out on open, unmediated digital platforms. And being as open and as unmediated as these platforms are, these have become spaces where very easily the scholar meets the statesman, meets the storyteller, meets the seeker. Frequently drawing from only a partially understood past, we see the urban Indian today wearing his identity stridently, both online and offline. And hence the question, what does it mean to be taking old India to young Indians? The questions we're asking today of our panelists are as follows. What creative yet responsible role can both the scholar and the storyteller play in providing the general public with a most importantly reliable narrative of their own history? And when I introduce the panelists, you will see that the common strand which runs through all of them is that they've successfully bridged the gap between being researchers and sutradars, storytellers. How do we sift between fact and fiction? How do we move from information to insight? The questions we're also asking are, how do we hence initiate a public discourse on our rich history that both educates and illuminates without being divisive in its very nature? How do we, most importantly, build and contribute to a culture of patient dialogue, which does not quickly devolve into a heated debate? I think these are the things we're interested in exploring this evening. And I'll be the first to admit that this is indeed a tall order, all these thorny questions which we're looking into. But I'm quite confident that the panel we have today is going to take on these questions gamely, and collectively, let's try and see if we can get some clarity in the midst of these confusing yet very exciting times. Let me start then by introducing the panel for today. Let me start with the first of our panelists, Reena Puri. Reena is an executive editor at Amar, Chitra, Katha. She's been with the group since 1991, so that's over close to 3 decades now. And she's worked extensively with the founder, Ananth Pai, before taking on her current role as executive editor in 2008. Before joining the Amar, Chitra, Katha group, she's tried out various roles, including, most interestingly, as a radio jockey at All India Radio. Under her editorship, the Amar, Chitra, Katha group has seen a revival with new series like the 6-part series Valmiki's Ramayana and Mahadeva, stories from the Shiva Purana, being released of late. Reena is also a prolific short story writer, with many of her stories being published across a mix of publications like the Illustrated Weekly of India, Caravan, Pratham Books, the Children's Book Trust of India, as well as being broadcast over BBC Radio. We're very happy to have Reena join us today. The second panelist is a native from the capital city of Delhi, Vikramjit Singh Rooprai. Vikram is a passionate full-time heritage activist, communicator, educator, game creator, and so many other roles which we will speak of later in today's discussion. Vikram's first book, which is an opening volume in a series of books on Delhi's heritage, is called Top 10 Baolis, and is the outcome of 5 years of research on the medieval stepwells of the city. Not just being content with being a writer, Vikramjit is also the dynamic force behind several other heritage-related initiatives. A comprehensive public website on the monuments of Delhi, a heritage photography club, and most interestingly, Heritage Shala, a first of its kind attempt where Vikram works with teachers in schools to set up heritage labs for children. Vikram speaks regularly at several TEDx communities and has served as an auditor for both UNESCO and the Aga Khan Trust in their heritage restoration efforts. Welcome, Vikram. Which brings me then to our youngest panelist for the day, Aniruddh Kanisetti. Aniruddh is an engineering graduate and has a day job as a public policy and geopolitics researcher at Bangalore's acclaimed Takshashila institution. But day job apart, what really consumes Aniruddh, I dare say, is his role as one of India's leading history podcasters. Aniruddh is the brain and voice behind Echoes of India, a podcast which spans 2 seasons and close to 25 episodes. And his newest brainchild is yet another podcast, Yuddha, a podcast on India's military history. Aniruddh writes regularly online and in newspaper publications on history and heritage, and his work has been recognized by the New Indian Express in their 2020 40 Under 40 list. For those who love a little humor in their history, do check out Aniruddh's Instagram meme series, The Chola Bhatura Empire. Welcome, Aniruddh. Our final panelist for the day is a well-known and familiar face for those in the audience who are from the city of Chennai. Dr. Chithra Madhavan has an MPhil, an MA, and a PhD in Indian history. She's a recipient of 2 postdoctoral fellowships, one from the Department of Culture and the second from ICHR, the Indian Council for Historical Research. She's also the author of 9 books on history, mostly dealing with the temples of Tamil Nadu. Dr. Chithra Madhavan serves as a history resource person and faculty member at several educational institutions in the city, including Kalakshetra, the Asian College of Journalism, and Dakshin Chitra. But she's perhaps most recognized of all as a much-loved Heritage Walk lead and has a large and loyal fan following of her own. Welcome, Dr. Chithra Madhavan. Please join me now in welcoming all 4 of our panelists as they join us in the studio for our discussion today. Welcome, Reena, Aniruddh, Dr. Chitra, and Vikramjit. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all here. And thank you so much for taking time out to join us this evening for this, what promises to be a very engaging and exciting panel discussion. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm going to try and start by drawing each of you into some kind of a warm-up session. And I'm going to start with Reena. Reena, if you can speak to our audience for a couple of minutes on your journey as the executive editor of Amar Chitra Katha. Given the session title, Taking Old India to Young Indians, there's probably been no other institution in the country which has done it for so long and so impactfully as Amar Chitra Katha. Tell us briefly what you see as Amar Chitra Katha's mission. And also, I think in line with the topic we're looking at today, what's changed in the last 3 decades you've been with this organization? What does the young generation of today want to know? Have their demands changed? And how has that influenced the work you do?
Okay, those are a lot of questions. I hope I remember them. Otherwise, you have to remind me in the middle. So, starting with, yes, my journey, began in 1991. And at that time, Anand Pai, our founder editor, he was in charge of, he was looking after Tinkle and Amar Chitra Katha, and I joined as associate editor of Tinkle. And that is when I came to know of the vision that he had. And the vision is exactly what our topic is today, taking the old India, the heritage of India, to the young people of India. And we've been doing it for the last 53 years. The whole idea that Anand Pai had was that if a child knows his heritage, knows his background, knows from where he has come, he develops self-confidence and self-esteem. So that is with what we went forward, and the vision continues even today after all these years, and we keep that in mind all the time. And of course, in these 53 years, a lot has changed. Like I have watched Amar Chitra Katha grow and Tinkle grow. And I would say about 3 to 4 generations of Indians have read Amar Chitra Katha. And there's been a huge change, if you ask me. You know, the earlier generations, the people who were reading it in the 1970s and the 80s, they did not have too much of a choice where it came to books and information as such. So for them, Amar Chitra Katha was the sole source of knowledge about the heritage of India. Whereas today there is a lot of information coming in from the web, from all kinds. It's an total influx of information. So we have stuck to a sort of fundamental rule that we will tell the stories that are of India in the most authentic way possible, because that's the way to go forward, I feel, especially with children. We tell it from the source, we tell it as authentic a detail. And there is a misconception that Amar Chitra Katha is all about mythology and more mythology, but it is not true. We have history, we have classical literature, we have folk tales and fables. So we cover India in every way. So when we say the heritage of India, we don't just mean the gods and goddesses. We mean our kings and queens. We mean our change makers, our sports people. We mean a whole lot of heroes, icons who we want to bring to the children. And this hasn't changed over the years. Maybe the way of looking at things has changed a bit, and quite a bit, in fact. The things that are important to children also have changed. The issues that are sensitive right now may not have been long back. The battlegrounds have changed. Earlier, it was more interest in the Battle of Panipat or the Battle of Khanwa. Today, the battlegrounds are environmental concerns. The battlefield is on the sports ground, the social change, those kind of things. So we had to change with the times and bring in more people, more people who have been working in these fields into stories in Amar Chitra Katha. So I would say that it's been a tightrope walking between generations, because even today, our 50% of our readers come from the age group 25 to 45, and they are hardcore loyalists of the old Amar Chitra Katha. But the younger people, younger children, they are more clued into what we do now and can identify with that. So we have to keep both sides happy, and so we do walk a tightrope between the two.
Thank you, Reena. And you spoke of change, and we're going to revisit that a little more as we go along in this conversation. So we'll come back to change. Thank you for that quick opening note. I'll move now to Dr. Chithra Madhavan. Dr. Chitra, you have a long and illustrious background of formal research in Indian history. You have a special interest in temple architecture and epigraphy. And like I said before, you've served as a history resource person, as a faculty member in educational institutions. You've been speaking for several years now to college students. You write often in journals. What has kept you going in your long track record of public engagement in history and heritage?
Thanks, Ashwin. I'm happy to be here with all of you. I started off in school loving history because I had a series of very, very good history teachers, and privilege not accorded to many. And I decided in the 8th standard that this is what I would do in college and as a profession. There was no looking back, and I stuck to my decision. It was difficult, but yes, and I went ahead the formal way, doing my MA, MPhil, and PhD. At one point of time, after I did my PhD, I was asked by an aunt of mine to give a lecture to a group of ladies. And that set me off talking to the general public. And I decided that I would do this along with my academic work also. And over the last decade, I've noticed that much has changed as far as the public perception of history is concerned. The history textbooks in schools continue to be as drab and dry as they were earlier. It's very, very sad that in a country like India, with these many centuries of recorded history, with these many monuments around us, we have everything going for us, and how we have successfully managed to make this subject dry and dull is something that I cannot fathom, but we've succeeded. And so children in schools generally don't like history, and hats off to publications like Amar, Chitra, Katha for feeding young students and older students as well history in such a palatable manner. All credit to Amar, Chitra, Katha and its team. And now I find that, like I said, over the last decade, there has been a perceptible change in how youngsters approach history outside of schools. I can speak for Chennai, and I know that there are many, many heritage walks happening, especially in the winter months and also in August, which centers around August 22nd, which we celebrate as Madras Day. And I find year after year, more and more youngsters coming in to join these walks and to attend talks. And this is something that makes us very, very happy. It's just that we need to focus more and more on school children and make the subject extremely interesting for them inside of schools and outside of schools as well. And whatever be their profession, let them go on to become whatever it is that they want. Not that all of them have to be historians, but let them understand that they come from a wonderful heritage, a culture that goes back so many centuries. It's living, it's thriving, it's throbbing here in India, and let them take a pride in this. That kind of pride we have to instill. And once that pride is instilled, what will happen is automatically our monuments will be taken care of. People will stop scribbling on them, scratching and defacing them. All this comes out of a lack of heritage awareness. And that is what we need to instill in them. It's coming ever so slowly. It's happening, and it needs to happen at a faster pace. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Chitra, you spoke of history being viewed as drab and dry. So we're going to talk about pedagogy and how we can infuse the fun element in learning history as well later on in the discussion. You also spoke about celebrating the spirit of the country's heritage and the sense of rejoicing in this richness of heritage which we have around us is also something we would like to touch on. I'll move now to welcome Aniruddh Kanisetti. Aniruddh, intrepid navigator of all things new media. You're amongst India's most popular history podcasters. You're a prolific blogger, public speaker, meme generator, as I've already said. Yours may not have been the longest of journeys amongst the panelists here, but surely there's been no dearth of excitement. So Aniruddh, talk us a little through your movement into the space of being a public communicator par excellence on all things history.
Thank you so much, Ashwin. Those are very, very kind words. And thank you to all the panelists for sharing your experiences. I'd like to actually build on what Dr. Madhavan was saying about how drab we think history is, because that's something that I experienced not too long ago. It's been about a decade or so since I wrote my board exams. And I remember being taught history as basically a succession of bullet points. It's not a continuous narrative. It's a very cherry-picked selection of historical topics which are believed to impart the core elements of a good Indian identity to students, but they don't really do a very good job of it. My strongest historical experience was not in school. It was during an internship in college. Like many South Indian guys, I ended up studying engineering. And I was interning in Kolkata when I happened to visit the Indian Museum and see a coin of Alexander the Great. Now, I tend to game a lot, so I'd been playing a lot of strategy games about Greek and Roman history. Unfortunately, Indian history hasn't really received that kind of attention yet, but that's a topic for later, I suppose. And as a result of that, I was familiar with the history of Alexander, and Alexander as a historical figure was somehow more real to me than any other Indian historical figure really was. And standing in the Indian Museum that day, I saw a coin of Alexander the Great. And it suddenly hit home to me just how vast and incredible and real history actually is. And I was looking around that gallery and just looking at Mughal coins, Gupta era coins, just thinking about the stories of the real people and just the absolutely crazy interactions that must have happened in India's history for all these artifacts of real lives to be all around me. And that was something that I really tried to bring across in my history podcast. They were the result of a lot of reading, a lot of personal exploration, because I was trying to answer the question of who I am and where my identity is in relation to everything that I could see around me. And in the process, I kind of realized that it's something that not a lot of younger Indians know about, but it's something that a lot of us are very curious about. And it's something that a lot of us tend to go out onto the internet to find answers to. Now, when I was in college, most people got their answers through, for example, Quora, which is full of all kinds of misinformation, which focuses more on like heedlessly glorifying the past in the interest of trying to create an interesting narrative. What I tried to do instead with Echoes of India, my first podcast, was give a sense of this reality and the sense of wonder and sheer scale and the absolutely crazy stuff that's gone down in Indian history and isn't properly attested in the public domain. There's a lot of work in the scholarly domain. There's some really interesting ideas that are being bandied about in Indian history today as a result of archaeological work and so on. But these are very often locked behind inaccessible paywalls. One perk of working in a think tank like Takshashila institution was that I had access to JSTOR, and that meant that I had access to scholarly journals. And so instead of looking purely at stuff on like archive.org, for example, which tends to be a history of like a slightly older generation, a slightly older view of what mattered and what is important in history, I tried to tell stories of an India that's as real and breathing as our India is today, as full of joy and wonder, and also as full of inequality and preventable suffering. And something about seeing a vision of India that's as real as today's is really resonated with my audience of mostly younger Indians. And it's been like truly breathtaking to see the kind of outpouring of love that I got. I never expected the podcast to be as popular that it actually is.
Excellent. So that was truly a fascinating backstory of that visit to the museum in Kolkata and that encounter with a coin from Alexander's times. Thank you for sharing that. I think what I also sensed in your opening statement, Aniruddh, is this infectious enthusiasm, I think, which is the hallmark of all your podcasts. And we're going to talk a little about how do we transmit that infectious enthusiasm to much larger sections of the Indian youth today. So I'm looking forward to that. And that brings me finally to Vikramjit Singh Rooprai. Welcome, Vikram. You're perhaps Delhi's most loved and most energetic heritage enthusiast. You've done multiple hats as well. You're a heritage researcher, a writer, a heritage activist, and a teacher who creates refreshing new pedagogical approaches to teaching history in schools, besides the photography projects you ever so often take on. Tell us, Vikram, in a city like Delhi, which is steeped as it is in both ancient and medieval history, what is the pulse of the youth there? What is it that the youth of Delhi want to know? And how has that enabled you to grow in this role you've chosen?
Well, thank you, Aniruddh. And before I start answering your question, I want to thank you for keeping me at the end, because while I was listening to everyone, especially Dr. Madhavan and Aniruddh, it was more like a flashback, because what they said is actually what I have gone through. And then I'm sharing stage with Reena Puri. I've grown up reading Amar Chitra Katha books, and now I'm so glad that even my daughter loves ACK products so much. Tinkle is her favorite. So coming from all that, and okay, I have been an engineer half of my life. Even now, just before joining the session, I was working on one IT project, which has been my bread and butter early in the days since, roughly half a decade ago, when I completely switched to education field. What brought me here is actually the answer of the question that you asked. About 12, 13 years ago, when I started exploring Delhi, I realized that people hardly know about the city, and there were no heritage walks happening back then. There was only one company which was catering to Indians, and they were also doing walks for foreigners. So mostly they were busy with foreigners, and there was absolutely no one who would actually come and talk to a common Indian person like me. So I thought, okay, I'll go on my own. I'll try to find some information. I'll talk to people. I divided Delhi into 4 zones, and I thought I'll spend 4 weekends. Just go to 10 to 12 monuments. I'll explore, and that's it. But when I started exploring, just one small portion of Delhi, which is called Mehrauli, where we have the famous Qutub Minar, it took me 1 year to finish that area because I could only give weekends. And I was trying to get into the depth research because there is this one park called Mehrauli Archaeological Park, which has got 72 monuments. And here I was thinking that entire Delhi has got 10 to 12. And while I was doing my research, I realized that Delhi has recorded more than 1,300 monuments in 1910, out of which hardly 750 survive today. So far, in last 12 years, I have seen only 450. Where are other monuments? We have their names, we have their locations, but they are not there. And when you go there, probably there is such a congested locality, you have to go through the streets and you have to knock someone's door to go inside and see that, okay, the wall is original, the wall still remains, but they have created something around it and now you can't identify the monument. So all those things are also there. So that made me worried also, and I actually wanted to do something about it. Started exploring, started reading, and then I realized that whatever information I want to study, want to find, people don't know about it. There are no blogs about it. It is not published anywhere. There are a few English books that I can read, hardly any Hindi book. However, there is a lot of information in old Urdu records which has not been translated yet. So I got onto it, learned Urdu, started reading that those manuscripts and content, whatever I could find. Reached a stage where I was confident that Delhi is much, much, much bigger than what anybody has ever imagined. And while all this was happening, and while my interest and my love for Delhi was growing day by day, I tried to talk to my office colleagues, and I said, why don't I take you to some monument and I show you how beautiful these monuments are? And they were not very much interested. I formed a small club. I thought maybe if I create a small club, people will become member of that club, and I'll take them there and I'll show them the monuments. So I started a club called Delhi Heritage Awareness Club. 2 or 3 people came. I took them, I showed them around, and I said, okay, this is what I've learned. This is what I've read from so and so manuscripts or historic records, books. This is the original history of the place. And they were like, oh, okay, very good. They enjoyed. And they were like, why don't people talk about this? I tried to get more people. Nobody was interested. So then what I did, I just changed the name of my club. I did nothing else. I just changed the name. From Delhi Heritage Awareness Club, I changed it to Delhi Heritage Photography Club. That's it. Everything else remained same. And one, let's call it the marketing tactic that I used. I said, if you come with me, I will show you a place where you can click a unique picture which you have never clicked and which nobody has ever seen. And those days, Orkut was going out and Facebook was in. So everybody wanted more likes, thumbs ups. That was a new thing those days. So I said, you can click photographs and you can put it on your Facebook account, on your wall, and you will get a lot of likes. Everybody wanted that kind of ego massage. So it kicked off, where I started with 4 or 5 people. Within 5-6 years, I had some around 15,000 people following me. Today, the Heritage Photography, we changed the name from Delhi Heritage Photography Club to the Heritage Photography Club. We have got some 25,000 followers who regularly, a major portion of that regularly interact with us from all over India. We get photographs and then we discuss those pictures. The only thing we said was that for all these walks and discussions or whatever we do, we'll not charge, we'll not pay. These are something where people should come together, because I realized that people don't want to pay to look at their own heritage. So I said, okay, fine, these are all free walks. I've learned something. If you have also learned something, come share with me. We'll exchange and we'll explore. So that's how journey started, and it has been really beautiful. Like others have also shared. So
all right. So I think 2 key takeaways from me from what you shared, Vikram. I think one is we are not talking about a passing interest, something like, which just holds your interest for a week or 2 or perhaps a month or so. We're talking about a lifelong commitment to interest in heritage. And I think that came through very strongly when you said you spent almost a year just studying one very small cross-section of a heritage monument. I think that's one important takeaway. The second interesting thing you spoke about is tapping into this this need to belong, which is very illustrative of this social media generation. I want to try and see if that can also be a double-edged sword, and then if it is, how does one navigate that space, which is at the same time very what shall I say, alluring, but at the same time can also have potential pitfalls when you're in when you're in the space of heritage dissemination. So we'll come back to that. Let's try and move now into the very heart of today's topic. So I want to start off with this question. I think, say for Aniruddh, perhaps in this panel, and for many of them in the audience, I think the situation we see today is somewhat of a curious reversal from the times we grew up in. And growing up in the 70s, the 80s, and maybe even for the first half of the 90s, I think we all grew up in times of an information paucity, the utter lack of access to, of easy access to information, let alone good quality, reliable information. Today, conversely, however, I think the youth of the country are growing up in a milieu where there's the situation of information ubiquity and maybe even information overload. In fact, very scarily, today information comes looking for us, even when we specifically don't go looking for it, right? And especially online, I think one can find, I think Aniruddh referred to it as well, one can find the entire gamut of information online, specifically again to history-related topics. And this can range from what is ludicrously untrue to the densely packed academic speak of ivory tower citadels from universities. It can also be pure, unadulterated entertainment sometimes. It could be rigid stances, rigid and very combative kind of stances adopted by ideologues, and everything in between, these shades of which I spoke of. So the question I'm asking is really this. As a disseminator of heritage information, how does one find his or her audience in this new world we live in? Let me start with Reena. And I think Vikram already spoke of it. Growing up in the 80s and the 90s, there was just this trusty triad of Amar, Chitra, Katha, Tinkle, and perhaps Chandamama, which constituted the entirety of Indian children's literature. But like you yourself said, the young child of today has a dozen different options, both online and offline, not all of which are always savory. So what are the challenges you face in this era of information ubiquity as a publisher? How do you navigate this strange new world? I mean, what has changed, and how have you adapted to this climate of always on kind of information, much of which is not necessarily authentic or reliable, as you yourself said?
Yeah. So I remember Anand Pai telling me that once he was part of an audience, somewhere, and there were people on the stage speaking, and there was some fact being, told, some historical fact, and somebody disputed. And the gentleman who was speaking, he said, no, I read it in Amar Chitra Katha. So that's when it struck Mr. Pai that when people read Amar Chitra Katha, they believe they're reading the right kind of information. So there was a total trust, and we try to live up to that trust. And we would do for each one of our titles, we do a whole lot of research, and we go into it very deeply. But in today's world, as you say, it is. I mean, we are walking on eggshells actually right now, and anything you say could be taken in one way or the other. There are people who appreciate. There are people who are there to maybe just for the heck of it put you down and things like that. So we have to navigate very carefully. For example. We did Valmiki's Ramayana, which was a truly authentic version of Valmiki's Ramayana. We've done Tulsi Ramcharitmanas. And then we did this collection of stories called Rama's Ring and other, versions of, mythology. And that had stories from tribal areas, it had stories from Ramban's Ramayana, it had, from Orissa, there were versions from Orissa, from the Bhil, from the Gond tribes, from all over the country, but they were not what they call the straight version of Valmiki. In some, Lakshman was the hero, in some, Sita was the heroine, the hero. Like she is the person who actually kills Ravan. And I would say a majority of people appreciated what we were doing. They really loved these versions, and they said, "We are so glad that you're bringing this out for children to read," because people feel that the diversity of this country has to be explored, has to be told to the child instead of giving just one straight version. At the same time, we had people, who were very upset with us and said, "How can you distort? How can you distort the epics like this?" And even if you try to tell them that we're not distorting, this is one version used by people of our country, people who belong to this great land and who think in a certain way. And, I'm sure all of us are free to think of a story a certain way or of a book in a certain way, and we should have the freedom to do so. But it is tough, and we have to negotiate this very, very carefully. So, what we do actually is, when we are sure what we are doing and we know we are doing right and we are not, I don't think, committing any grave sin, we just see to it that we have our sources right. We know where we are coming from. So that if anybody says, "How do you get this kind of a story?" We say, "Okay, we got it from this particular source, and this is where we come from, and this is the author." And we can give that explanation. So now we have to be careful that whatever stories we use have a proper, authentic source.
And I think that kind of gives us a nice segue into a question I wanted to ask Aniruddh as well. So Aniruddh, like I said, you represent this young, bold, independent voice, which is trying to cut through all the ambient noise. And your Echoes of India podcast series is one such example. So the question I want to ask you, Aniruddh, is how do you respond when you realize that the consumers of your podcast are not always going to like what they hear about themselves and their own history? And I think that kind of ties in a little with what Reena spoke of as well and her experience. So what has your experience been?
That's a great question, Ashwin. And I think it kind of, it depends on the period that we're looking at. Frankly, for Echoes, because it looks at ancient India more, I haven't gotten a lot of backlash against it because a lot of people are curious about ancient India and just want to learn more about it. The one serious backlash I got was from somebody on Twitter who was like, "Why are you talking about Buddhist history? It's all about Hindu history in ancient India." I mean, but Twitter isn't really the best place for conversations like that. For my second podcast, Yuddha, where I try to talk about medieval India, which also involves topics that are extremely contentious in public history today, such as the Turkic invasions of northern India and the conflict between Vijayanagara and the Deccan Sultanates, that proved to be a lot more controversial because that's something that really, really gets religious and nationalists going. And I have gotten some backlash from that. I choose not to engage with backlash on Twitter because I find that Twitter is a platform that is not designed for engagement. It's a platform that's designed for emotional rants. And you can't really express nuanced historical arguments in 280 characters. But people who message me on Instagram, I find to be a lot more interesting because while there are, of course, people who jump to conclusions and are quick to kind of apply labels to me, I find there's also a lot of people who are open to reasonable debate. It's just that they grow up in a particular echo chamber. A lot of my fellow panelists have talked about this information deluge, but somehow, oddly enough, within this deluge of information, there's also echo chambers, which leads to certain narratives getting repeated again and again and again until they become the truth. And sometimes people, especially if you talk to them on a person-to-person basis, instead of in the madness that is Twitter, are much more willing to engage with you. If you ask them, for example, what are your sources? Why do you believe this? What does this particular thing mean to you? This is where I'm coming from. Having a more slow debate helps. In a lot of cases, though, you simply can't convince people who are at either extreme of the political spectrum. In cases like that, I find it's a lot more useful to just appeal to the middle ground and appeal to basic humanity. And that's something that I found a lot of people do respond to. focusing on the facts, focusing on interpretation of the facts, and focusing on making things interesting makes people see you as a human being, makes people more willing to engage with you as a human being, and then not just dismiss all your arguments, all your claims out of hand. So it's a very gradual process, but I believe that over time we can create change.
Right. I really like the words you used. I think you said slow, and I would equate that with patient, right? And you also said sources, and so did Reena say. So essentially what we're talking about is a rational kind of dialogue and not debate, as I referred to earlier. And these seem to be some of the ingredients which one needs in the mix of heritage dissemination today. There's also this question I would like to ask Vikramjit. Perhaps amongst the four panelists today, you're the one who works most closely with school teachers and children and in schools. So Vikram, when you go out and visit schools and talk to children and their history teachers, what is a sense of identity formation which you get from them? Where do they form these identities of their own? Does it come from the singular source of the textbook? Perhaps not, as we are already beginning to talk about today. There seem to be these myriad other information sources which kind of feed into their own identity. So the question I really want to ask you is, what is the role of the textbook itself, and what is the role of pedagogy, the way you see it in Heritage Shala, when it comes to engaging with youngsters?
Yeah. So when I interact with school children and school teachers, the content that I share with them or questions I ask them are slightly different. We try to stay away from mythological debates. We do have discussions, but we try to stay away from heated debates where we know arguments can go into a different direction. And that is primarily because schools are not comfortable. That's another problematic thing, I would say, that most of the schools are not comfortable that any teacher coming from outside starts talking to these students and try to change the way their families have been bringing them up. So whatever stories they have been hearing from their families, we try to engage with them. And in case of schools, another thing is that most of the kids are from same area or locality, so they all would have similar kind of story to share. However, I very recently had an experience with one of the students in a university where I teach. So I was talking about different versions of Ramayana, and when we were talking about Gond Ramayana and Ramakya of Thailand and the Vietnamese and Cambodian version, this one girl stood up and she said that, sir, I'm sorry, but I want to object, but you cannot be telling me that Sita is Ravana's daughter, or in some case Sita is Ravan's sister, or in some case Ram doesn't even kill Ravan, Lakshman does it. Valmiki Ramayana is the only true Ramayana because that is the Ramayana that we have grown up reading. So that's the truth. So I said, if you have grown up reading that Ramayana, that doesn't mean that it is the only version. There are other versions, and I'm not saying this one is wrong or other one is wrong. All I'm saying is that there are different versions of a story. But then that child was not ready to accept. Now, what I personally feel is that this becomes the responsibility of our entire education system, that right from the beginning, we should actually inject this whole idea that no matter what kind of history you read, there is no one version. There are always multiple versions, and we should be ready to analyze multiple versions, because what we read or what we know are just interpretations. Someone saw or someone witnessed, wrote it down, someone copied it, someone further copied it. Down the line, few centuries later, the interpretation has actually changed. It has become a Chinese whisper. So if there are multiple interpretations, why don't you read all those interpretations and create your own interpretation? At least you will own that piece of history. You will believe in that piece of history. But that whole research thing is kind of missing in our system when belief comes into
very
play.
Interesting. I think what comes through very palpably, Vikram, I think, is you describe this ceaseless tension between myth on one side and history on the other. And I think people on either side believe that everything which the other side has to say is wrong, right, and unacceptable. But I think being in the field of history and heritage dissemination, one needs to walk this tightrope between myth and history all the time, as Reena referred to. So we'll go into that a little more as we go along in this discussion. Dr. Chitra, I have one question for you, somewhat related to this theme which we are exploring. You've worked for several decades now in the field of history communication, and the devices you've adopted for are public lectures, articles in journals, heritage walks, so on and so forth. I want to ask you, Dr. Chitra, for the serious scholar today, are there new ways of engaging with the public on your subject matter itself? And have you explored some of these ways in the recent past? You're on mute, Dr. Chitra.
For the serious student of history, for the scholar, it's a little difficult to talk to the general audience because you have been trained in such a way that you're researching all the time and writing books with footnotes and endnotes and all of that. So to not really dilute, that's not the right word, to put it across in a very palatable form to the general public is a challenge for the serious scholar. But the times now are such that it has to be done. I don't see many serious students of history in the next generation. It's sad, but it's true. We have to accept it. So in order to make this subject interesting, in order for more youngsters to come to this subject, we have to feed it to them in a manner in which they'll start loving it. And one of the ways to do that is to write books with lots of photographs. I've seen that photographs attract youngsters. So maybe a book full of photographs with captions or a little bit of text and a lot of photos will help. It's happening. There are many people doing it, and I've also tried my hand at that. Heritage walks. I think this is what is going to capture the audience. They love coming out early in the morning or late in the evening and looking at all these monuments. Cultural history is what we need to focus on. We need political history, we need the background of dates, but just churning out dates after dates after dates is what children hate, youngsters hate. I didn't grow up liking all of that. We just have to, it is imperative, it is mandatory that we hand it to the next generation in a nice manner, something that they will like, and then slowly take them on a serious path of history. Those of them who want to do it can do it. But yeah, yes, we need to focus.
You spoke of the power of the visual, Dr. Chitra, and I think that's quite true. I think images do catch people's attention, and that can provide a great entry point into understanding some of the topics which we are discussing. But not too far off from the visual, the striking visual, is also this this entertainment culture, which I want to talk a little of. I think what we're seeing happen thanks to Instagram, Netflix, Facebook, WhatsApp. I think some of these social media platforms, what they've resulted in doing is creating this what one only can refer to as an entertainment culture. Sadly, a vast majority of the young population today wants information which is not too taxing on the brain, it's not too time consuming, and not too serious, right? And I think all of these present challenges to the serious communicator, as Dr. Chitra said. As a result of this, I think we have moved past the era of 2-minute noodles, but I think we are very much in the era of 2-minute opinions, right? So we want to form an opinion and we want to form it in 2 minutes. And if you can help me do that, then I have time for you. I think that seems to also be an attitude which we're seeing, which is quite prevalent in the youth today. And I think to cater to this demand, what one has ended up seeing is a proliferation of convenient, but also frequently erroneous stereotypes of historical characters, misrepresentations of historical events, all of which are purely done to pander to audience demand. And sometimes we see just plain conspiracy breeding in popular media, be it films, tweets, or Facebook posts. And this seems to be an unfortunate fallout of this generation, which is constantly looking to be entertained, right? So it's just a short hop away from a striking visual to a moving image 2-minute capsule which tells me all about the golden age of the Guptas, for example, right? So the question I really want to now move into is there an opportunity then for serious people to collaborate with creative artists, right? So for example, can a historian meaningfully work with, say, a graphic novelist or a meme artist? Can the heritage activist work with a school teacher to build a representation of our country's history, which is more complete, more accurate, more reliable, verifiable, and in the process also more engaging? So what is the place of collaborations? I think each of you specialize in a certain kind of communication dissemination. So I'm asking if there are possibilities of coming together, of collaborating together, and whether this digital world we live in allows for that easily. So maybe Aniruddh, we can start with you. I think on your podcasts, what has been the reception you've got when you've approached research scholars to help you with your research? Have they been welcoming? Have they been excited about this new medium you're exploring? Can you talk to us a little about that, please?
I've actually been overwhelmed by how kind a lot of serious researchers have been when I sent them my podcast. I remember reading a book about Amaravati by Professor Akira Shimada, who has done possibly the most comprehensive work on the Amaravati Stupa. And he said that I have a great voice for podcasting, which, as you can imagine, like really excited me and got me to do more podcasts. I've also done collabs with historians like Srinivas Reddy, for example. He recently wrote this biography of Krishnadevaraya. And Srinivas and I have been in contact for about a year or two. And even though we live on opposite sides of the world, the fact that we're able to collaborate digitally means that we can do things that would never have happened perhaps like just a decade or two ago. He, for example, recorded a voiceover of a couple of verses from the Amukta Malyada for my Yuddha podcast where I talked about Vijayanagara. But beyond just scholars, I feel like, as you said, Ashwin, like in terms of facilitating interactions between creative people, social media has absolutely been great. On my Instagram profile, when this whole lockdown started because of the pandemic, I put up a call to any artist who'd be interested in collaborating with me. And we did some really fascinating stuff. Like I worked with this Canadian Chinese artist based in Toronto, and we did this beautiful sketch of an imagined interaction between a Chola princess and a princess of the Song dynasty. So just in terms of making historians aware of creators and making creators aware of historians, and in terms of kind of leveling the world and flattening it and making more collaborations possible, social media has done it's unlocked some really interesting potential.
Okay, thanks, Aniruddh. Reena, I want to pull you in here now and hear from you on this. So the danger of being widely popular, as Amar Chitra Katha is, and I think lots of people have kind of testified to that, is that anything which does not conform to what is widely popular is also easily seen as inauthentic. So to borrow this line from Spider-Man movie, with great power comes great responsibility as well. So I specifically want to ask, in this new entertainment age kind of culture which we find ourselves in, and for an institution like Amar Chitra Katha, which is so successful and popular, what are the checks and balances you build into your editorial process itself, which kind of keep you on the right track and not let you easily pander to what the reader wants, which is the convenient truth, right? And I think perhaps this is a critique which has been leveled at a large part of Indian children's literature in the past, which is there are several stereotypes, right, which don't necessarily elaborate on the complexity and nuance of these real world issues. There are views which wouldn't quite fit in the times we live in, right? And some of these have kind of been propagated as well. But you spoke about adapting to the times, and you spoke about also what would I say, feeling the pulse of what the reader wants today. So the question I want to ask you is, how is Amar Chitra Katha working to come up with something which is far more nuanced, layered, and which is not just black and white, right? And hence not easily pandering to this entertainment culture.
Absolutely. In fact, since I took charge of Amar Chitra Katha, that is, around 2008, So we've been looking at what children want, what children are reading, and what are sensitive issues today. So if the criticism leveled at Amar Chitra Katha is that the asuras are dark and the devas are fair, or certain section of community is shown as marauders and tyrants, and the other guys are the good guys. So we have been accused of a lot of things and of showing women in a poor light. So where I always say that those comics were written in the 60s and 70s with a certain kind of 70s and 80s, sorry, with a certain kind of mindset, certain kind of audience, and those were accepted in those days. But today when I look at the children and I look at what my kids would read or would appreciate, and my young team, I've got a very young team at Amar Chitra Katha, so we are very careful about what we are choosing and what we are giving up to the children. So even if I do a Valmiki's Ramayana, when I read that Ramayana, I realized that Sita is a very forward-thinking, very aggressive, very vocal person, and she was never shown as that earlier. But we showed it in the new Ramayana, which we've brought out. We've shown Sita as a strong person who speaks her mind, who can scold Rama when she feels like, who loses her temper with Lakshman. At the same time, there are so many characters in our history whom the school books don't talk about at all, especially women. There are women freedom fighters. There are women path breakers. So I have seen to it that we bring them into the Chitrakat fold as well. So we have Rukma Bai, we have Nitarama Bai, we have Annamani, we have people whom children have not heard of at all. And these are women who actually broke the barriers, broke the ceiling, and moved forward and carved a path, which is why I am sitting here, today and talking to you so freely. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to. We're grateful to these women for having broken those barriers. Then we have the women freedom fighters. Nobody talks about women freedom fighters. We think of freedom fighters, it's Gandhi, it is Patel, it is, the usual. But there are other people. There's Jhalkai Bai, there is, Farhana Asaf Ali, there is Sucheta Kriplani. There are so many other women, Kanak Lata Barua, who fought, and children must come to know about it. So that is where we have changed. We have brought in these new, sensitivities, and are trying to create an Amar Chitra Katha which will cater to the generations of today and speak to them directly.
Thank you. I think what I hear you saying, Reena, is essentially most heritage communicators are in the operate in the realm of education, right? And when you operate in that space of education, I think it's not just the trivial matter of supply meeting demand and catering to what popular demand is. I think one needs to go far beyond that and break new ground. And if it means cultivating an audience for this kind of literature, then I think one needs to button down and kind of work on that, even if it means the long haul. So that's what I hear from you, Reena. I think we've spent quite some time talking about the virtual world. So now I want to hop over from there and focus on the very physical world which all of us live in. So in this age of digital ephemera, right, where everything is so short-lived, what is the role that can be played by this vast physical legacy of heritage sites, monuments, palaces, forts, museums, galleries, right, galore, all of which we have in this country. So what is really the role which these very physical entities can play in awakening an entire generation to awareness of their rich heritage? So I'm going to start with Dr. Chitra here. Ma'am, how do we keep the good old trusty museum alive and well in this age? Just put your...
Sorry. It's the focus of what we should be doing all the time. So we have museums across the country, sometimes in small towns, we have the ones in the bigger cities. And unfortunately, let me speak my mind, not in the best of maintenance. Some of them don't have plaques, they don't have literature where that children can read up, or whoever goes to the museum can read up. We are lagging behind in that aspect, and in some of the heritage sites as well. There are several things that can be done. Audio guides. We need to have guides at many of the heritage sites as well. little souvenirs that they can take away. This is what people like, and we see that in many of the countries abroad. So all these places, the forts, the palaces, the temples, whatever heritage sites that we have in India, there's an abundance. And sometimes I think it's because of the abundance that we don't pay enough attention to them. And we are not looking at them as the focal point for creating heritage awareness. We are not even utilizing them to the nth degree. We are not doing it. There is a need first, and this has been my opinion for a very long time. We need to first focus on local history to get people, children, adults, any age group, get them interested in what you have in the place around you. Be it a small town or be it a big city, get them interested in what has happened in this place for many hundreds of years, thousands of years, in fact. And that will instill in them a sense of pride. And then it can go, to other places in India, and automatically they'll start traveling. Automatically they'll go to other heritage sites. It's bound to happen. So get them interested in local history, which means take them to the museums and explain the artifacts in a fun way, in a very interesting way. Take them to there is every place has heritage sites. We just need to make use of them. That's all, in a very intelligent way.
All right. I think when we collectively look at a topic like taking old India to young Indians, I think what is also becoming apparent is while there is a role which the individual communicator, the heritage enthusiast can play, there also seems to be an equally important role which the institution can play. And then there needs to be institutional support. And I think you spoke of that, making museums vibrant, fun, exciting, alive places. And that seems to be one part of the jigsaw puzzle as well, which needs to kind of fit in for this project to kind of gain momentum in one sense. Vikramjit, you have written this really lovely book on Baolis of Delhi, the stepwells of Delhi. And I think it's an excellent effort because it becomes a way of introducing something which is in the life and blood in your own vicinity, right? But I'm going to ask you, beyond the book, how do we get you to experience this rich heritage firsthand in a way which is not mediated by book or film or even voice, but right out there, feeling the air around that particular heritage site, touching and feeling and just awakening to this massive scale of some of these monuments? How do we try and achieve that?
Well, Ashwin, answer is simple. You need to touch the real pulse. We know that majority of people that, at least the students that I interact with, there are many students who are not interested in history, perhaps because during their school days, early days, history, the way they were taught or the way the books are written, like ma'am has already shared, it was so monotonous that now they have lost their interest. So history has been officially branded as the most boring subject. They do love going out. What they enjoy is science aspect of it, the engineering, the architecture aspect of it. So if I can take those boring stories away and bring in the science element of it, children would enjoy. I'll give you a very quick example. If I'm taking someone to Qutub Minar, I'll just tell them that, okay, right now Qutub Minar has got 5 stories, but originally when it was built, there were 4 stories. The 4th story got destroyed during Firoz Shah Tughlaq's time, and he had to rebuild it. And instead of making 1 story of the same size, he built 2 stories, 2 levels instead. So what is the architectural requirement? Because did he realize that it will not sustain for long? There is some problem with that. Other thing that I can discuss is that Qutbuddin Aibak has mentioned that I am using material from 27 temples to create Quwwatul Islam, or the mosque that we now know as Quwwatul Islam, originally Jama Masjid. Now, were those 27 temple of the same community from the same period? No, because when you stand there, you see Jain Tirthankars as well as Kirti Mukhas. So, and the stone, the kind of stone that is used. Within the same corridor, you see 7 to 8 different types of stones. So I can actually go there and I can talk about what is a sandstone, and on the other side where I have got a red color stone and a pink color stone. So what is the difference between that? What is the quartzite and the variation of quartzite that I have? Now I'm only talking about geography with them. I'm not even talking about history. While discussing geography, I can bring in a little bit of history. I'll give you one more example. Mona Lisa. Almost every child in the school knows about Mona Lisa. Now I can pull up a picture of Mona Lisa, start talking about it, the brush strokes, and whether Mona Lisa is smiling or not, which way she's looking, and then I can talk about Leonardo da Vinci, who he was, what kind of clothes he was wearing, what kind of brush he was using. The bristle at that time were made of which uh, animal hair or what it was. And then I can also, while discussing this, I can bring up all his inventions, one of them being catapult, and his catapult design is considered to be the most efficient because he used a rubber band in that and he created something very unique. So theoretically, that is the best catapult ever. While talking about it, depending on which class I'm talking to, class 6 or 7, I can start with basic stuff. Class 4 5, I can talk about pulley and fulcrum. Higher classes, kinetic energy, potential energy, elasticity, throughput, projections, entire physics can come into it. And I just started with a discussion on Mona Lisa's smile. So if we can do this kind of integrated learning, that has been my journey throughout, bringing in different topics into one. And when you are going to monuments also, don't just look at them and tell plain simple history. Try to discuss the architecture and the engineering part of it. There was water. How was water flowing from this portion to this portion? How were they stopping it? Sluice dams. We still have 3 sluice dams in Delhi, which I take my students to. How the gates were operating? What kind of pulley fulcrum were they using? So those elements are what bring the interest of a child into this whole matter.
Got it. So essentially what you're saying is there are many ways to a child's imagination, to kind of unlock a child's imagination. And I think it is the responsibility of educators and communicators to try and allow for that to happen. I think when I was a teacher, I think what we spoke of a lot was to break the tyranny of the classroom and the tyranny of the textbook. I think to start with, more children and more teachers need to leave the classroom and get out there and actually visit some of these sites. And I think you're saying the same thing. And how can one learn from the very environment we live in, right? Be it the natural environment or the social environment. And how can one learn from all this built heritage which is around us? And I think to start, we need to leave the classroom and move away from the textbook, perhaps. Thank you for sharing that, Vikram. I think we're going to take maybe 5 more minutes of our discussion, and then I'm hoping that there'll be lots of questions from the audience which we can answer. So I'm looking forward to that. But before we go there, I think our experience at Tamil Heritage Trust in organizing a conference of this nature, an Indology festival as we've chosen to call it, is that there is lots of rich heritage, I think, in this land, and which many people are aware of. But I think what we've also learned through this conference is that there is much which is not known. For example, on day 3 of this on conference, we learned from 2 speakers of fundamental contributions in mathematics which were made by medieval Indian mathematicians, and not too many people know of that. We've also learned of the gods of India and their travels to distant lands through coins. We've also come in touch with this living historical puzzle which exists, for which we don't yet have any good answers. And I'm talking about the Indus Valley script here. So there's so much which is known, but there is much more which is not known. So really, I'm hoping we can spend some time also talking a little about how do we create more such fora, be it conferences or workshops in schools, perhaps interactive university courses, to try and get the youth of the country more invested in learning about this history of theirs. I'm going to go back to Vikram again. I know you've just launched this card game which deals with the princely states of India. Incidentally, on day 3 of this conference, I think one of the speakers spoke about how there are many fun and creative ways in which pedagogy can be enhanced in the classrooms, and knowledge of history can be brought in. And he spoke about how school children would be only too happy to learn about the magic squares, right? To which there have been fundamental contributions made by medieval Indian mathematicians. So I want to quickly ask you, you've just launched a fun card-based game. What has been the response to that game? What is the role of gameplay and role-playing games? Aniruddh spoke about his interest in gaming and how that seemed to be a very unlikely starting point for exploring history. But Vikram, how do you use games in your interactions with school and school children?
So I set up heritage labs. That's what heritage shala or heritage ki prayog shala is all about. And when I go to schools, I tell them that I'm gonna teach you physics, chemistry, maths, all other subjects but history. So I'm not gonna talk about history. However, while I'm teaching you physics, chemistry, maths, or science, or political science, or anything, you will learn history, because when all those things were happening back in past, that at that time they were not history. At that time they were just current affairs. So we will transport ourselves to that era, and then we learn. Second thing what I do is, so since you already mentioned the game, this is the card game that I have built. And what I do is, uh, it has got information about the princely states of India, but then, and there are 85 salute states rather, but I don't use them to teach history. I use them to teach maths and English. So one of the games is the where you hold 5 cards and use first or last alphabet from each card and create a word, English word, or what you just hold 3 cards in your hand, and these cards have got the gun salutes mentioned. So Porbandar, the state, was getting 13 gun salutes. Cochin had 17. Indore had 19. Now, what you need to do is you need to write a formula. Maybe A plus B is equal to C something as, or A plus B divided by C is equal to what? The child has to hold these, plot these values into that formula in his mind, and come up with the answer. So we made games around these. And while he's throwing these cards, he has to say, I'm throwing Indore, Porbandar, and Cochin, which are now part of Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, and Kerala. This is how, in a subtle way, he will be learning history. So my objective is to help them learn different things, and in a very subtle way pass on those lessons from history. Because once he gets hooked on to, I've got many such games. Once he gets hooked on to those things, he can remember them in much better way than we telling them in the year 1500 so and so Akbar came, he attacked, he killed, he won. They are bored of that stuff. Trust me.
Yeah,
That's my way.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing quite uniformly across all 4 speakers is we need to move into we need to move into a zone where I think entry barriers to history need to kind of be pulled down, right? And it shouldn't depend on pure recollection of fact and data points, so on and so forth. So before I go to the first audience question, Reena, very quickly, a somewhat radical thought, but has Amar Chitra Katha ever been approached by, let's say, school textbook committees across the country, right, to partner with and explore ways in which textbook content can be made more engaging, but yet stay true to fact? Have you been approached by anyone? Have you worked on such projects?
Not with the school textbook companies, but schools themselves have asked us, to give them parallel titles. Like suppose they're doing something on Razia Sultan, they would like to take the comic on Razia Sultan and keep it as part of the reading. Because we've run some experiments in schools, and it's shown that children read the textbook and they read the comic, remember more facts from the comic. Because as you know, as you said, the pictures and less text and more pictures, it really works with kids. So we have schools telling us, that if we can have a parallel kind of reading material for them, and a lot of libraries do take our titles to as
Right.
a supplementary reading in history
Right. So I'm going to move on now to the first question from the audience, and this comes from a person called Sabarish Kumaran. And this is a very important question, I believe, which we should spend some time looking at in this forum. Sabarish asks, students pursuing history, and he means the humanities really, are criticized and disrespected in South India, and I would venture to say perhaps in North India as well. And doctors and engineers are held in high esteem. So how can we change this entrenched attitude in India? I'm going to go first to Dr. Chitra to try and answer that, and then I'm going to come to Aniruddh, because he's probably someone who's kind of worked against this this notion of engineering being at the top of the hierarchy of subjects a child learns. So, Dr. Chitra, how does one work against this this mental block that humanities are meant for those who can't do engineering or medicine? If you can just take yourself off mute, Dr. Chitra, we can't hear you. And if you could just start all over again. Dr. Chitra, we still can't hear you. Dr. Chitra, we still can't hear you. Maybe you, I'm not sure your earphones are plugged in, so maybe you just, yeah. Yes. Can you
hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So if there was one person who was criticized and disrespected, it was me. I've been through that because I decided to study history, and family, not my parents, but extended family, friends, neighbors, history. Why do you want to study history? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Oh, life I faced this question, So I don't know what I'm going to do. I want to study history, so will you please let me alone? And nobody let me alone. Till today, they're asking me why I wanted to study history. This in a country where you have, I keep saying this, these many centuries of recorded history. It's a beautiful culture, it's a beautiful heritage, and you're criticized for studying this subject. I don't know why. I mean, if there's a child that likes the subject, let her be. Whatever she wants to do or he wants to do with his life, let him do it. Let her do it. But such is the situation. I'm not so sure about North. North, I feel it's slightly better, but in South India, you are not allowed to study history. People just don't like it. And people who have no concern are very concerned about why you want to study history. That is the truth. It was there when I studied. It's still there now. And it's also because of what that particular student will do for the future. Other than becoming a lecturer, they just don't know what they will do for bread and butter. So the one way to change this, and I've thought long and hard about this, is to create more job opportunities. That's the only way this whole scenario can be changed. If a person, a child, a student studying history can go on to get a better job and income, that's all it boils down to. You're asking him to study history or medicine or law or whatever it is because there are better job opportunities and the child can grow into a young man or a young woman earning well. They think that's it. That's basically it. Create more job opportunities.
Yeah, I think what you're also saying is the part of the problem lies. If you can just put yourself on mute, Dr. Chitra. Yeah, I think what you're saying, Dr. Chitra, is part of the problem also lies in the way society views education as merely a means to a livelihood and not much else. And I think we have the right person in trying to perhaps shed some light on that. Aniruddh, you've been there and back. So can you tell us this invisible hierarchy which exists, you went along with it for some time before you found your true vocation. And can you help answer some of Dr. Chitra's concerns?
First, let me say hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I know that they're both listening and they were both involved in my decision to take engineering. I mean, I think that what Dr. Madhavan was saying about the idea that employment is very important to why it's so low in the hierarchy is really key here. I had to prove that other careers outside of engineering, outside of IT, had to work before my family got on board with this. But to their credit, they've been like extremely supportive of this whole decision ever since I've actually successfully made that transition. As to how these jobs can be created, that's something that I have been thinking about a little bit because it's something that I want to do full time. I work in the policy space to pay the bills right now, but eventually I'd like to be a full time historian. How can that be created? I think tour guides through museum curation, have more museums, make tourism more of a thing, build better facilities to help explore heritage sites. And most importantly, I think the value of an academic, the value of a public intellectual needs to change in India. It is very ironic that in a country with centuries of a great history of debate and thought about many different things, somehow today intellectuals are not given the kind of respect that they deserve. If historians and other kind of academics, just generally in the arts and humanities, are seen as people who are contributing to kind of steering us as a society rather than just people who are sitting in an ivory tower or sitting unemployed and working in McDonald's, then that can help change. This idea that only engineers and lawyers and chartered accountants who have stable jobs are good citizens or are good family people needs to change through more employment opportunities and through a societal importance to intellectual discourse and just public debate, which I don't think India has right now.
I'm going to move on to a question from Akila Seshadri, who asks, can you help young people to look at complex history through debate? And she quotes the example of TED Ed, the education arm of TED, which has a history versus X series. She asks, is it possible to create something as tough as that in Indian history? Something which is both fun and quite layered, yet complex. And she's asking if each of you in your own spheres can find ways to take tough questions, given the fact that history books don't seem to be doing that for children these days. So which of you would like to go? All right, we'll stay with Aniruddh then. Yes.
Thank you for that question. And I think it's definitely possible to do it. I try to do that quite seriously in my military history podcast, because quite frankly, if you look at India after like the first millennium, you see some things that really need to be talked about more in textbooks, especially the history of religious violence that the country has seen, but also beyond that, the history of religious interaction and just how complex identities can be in early modern India. This idea that some historical figures are beyond questioning, I think, is something that really has to change. We can no longer be in an India where Ashoka is considered as the single greatest king who's ever lived, or Akbar was the single greatest king who ever lived. Because if you present historical figures as caricatures, I kind of feel like people intuitively realize that that's not how people really are. And so they go and try to find the truth for themselves and end up going down this rabbit hole of misinformation, which is why you see so much hate for people like the Mughals, for example. But I definitely think it's possible. I think it's not just possible, but an imperative for historians to facilitate difficult conversations about historical figures.
There's a thorny question which has come up now from the audience, and it's from Vinayan, who asks, how do historians stand with their politics in the way it is brought to the public realm, say the way Galliano does? So essentially, if I were to try and paraphrase that question, is any thought or any action of a historian or a history communicator, can it be divorced from that person's individual politics? And is it possible? Is it necessary? Reena, do you want to try and take a stab at that?
Okay. I think I would say that I allow the vision that guides Amar Chitra Katha to guide the way I am going to look at the titles I choose or the kind of stories I give. So yes, we all have our our firm beliefs and our firm political thought, but sometimes we cannot bring that out when we are doing work like this. So what I do is I follow a single vision, which is the children of my country, they need icons from our country. So let me look at the great historical figures, at the great mythological figures, at the great stories in classical literature, and let me give them that, and not in any way, bring in any of my biases into the picture. At least that has guided me all these years, helped me choose my stories well. So I don't really take sides as such, but yes, there is one basic, honesty that you have to have towards yourself, and that does affect some of the stories that you put forth. For in a very simple example, like we've been told so often that why don't you do biographies of film stars? And I find it is more useful to do a biography of a social change maker rather than a film star. So in that, maybe my bias does come in. That what will the child learn from this story? So if I put two characters and I find one person weighs out the other, then I use the person who's going to maybe give the child a little more than the other one. So it's a question of, yeah, basically that.
Dr. Chitra, would you like to weigh in on that? You can just take yourself off mute. Yes.
For sure, objectivity is the key. So we all have our views. They're all opinionated in one way or the other at different levels. But we need, when we look at something, we need to take a step back, become objective, consciously do that, and then, deliver what we want to say. The personal aspect should be kept aside, and then now you're a professional historian and you look at it from that perspective. That's exactly how it should be done. Easier said than done, but then it has to be done.
Yeah, I think I think if you could just mute yourself. I think perhaps what the questioner was also alluding to was, is there something like true objectivity at all, especially in history? So what is a fact, and is there something called an objective fact at all, or is it just a series of interpretations based on evidence which each person chooses to look at slightly differently and carrying their own political biases and baggages? But anyway, so we'll let that pass for now. And I think very quick functional question, Vikram, from someone in the audience. Sabrish Kumaran asks, where and how can we buy those cards, sir?
Well, in a couple of days, I'll be putting it up on Amazon. But as of now, my website, heritageshala.com, has got the link. I had put a few cards as special edition packs as pre-launch. So tomorrow is when we start, or rather day after tomorrow, we start our dispatch, the first lot. So you can just search for Princely States of British India, or you can go to heritageshala.com. You'll get the information over there.
Thank you, Vikramjit. There's this question I would like the panel to take a look at. It's from a person called Ranjani Chandran, who says, would it help if there was a change in the format of exams in history? Would it be less difficult if expectations weren't long, arduous answers? So I'm not going to try and venture my opinion on that. I would like the panel to really try and share what they feel about that question. So Dr. Chitra, do you want to try first?
Yes, definitely. The format of teaching has to be changed, and the format of examinations has to be changed. First of all, the syllabus has to be changed. So if the syllabus is not changed, the teacher has to make it as interesting as possible by, again, going out of the classroom rather than staying in the classroom. If the examination pattern is changed, all these essays that we wrote, sheets and sheets of paper, that needs to be changed. So now that you have PPTs, you have so many other techniques that you can use. Why not use all of that and make it far more interesting? There are ways and ways, and you just have to apply your mind to it.
I think the unfortunate. Thank you. I think what's been unfortunate, I think, primarily perhaps in examinations in history, has been an undue emphasis on memorization and then reproduction of that content which you've committed to memory. But is there a place for observation, for rational argument, for connecting the dots between various pieces of facts and evidence, right? And I think these are skills which perhaps can be honed in the studying of history itself. Aniruddh, would you like to comment on that?
I'm sorry, Ashwin, I don't think I caught that last sentence.
No, I was just saying, based on what Dr. Chitra was saying, unfortunately, history examinations today seem to lay a heavy emphasis on memorization of content, committing that to memory, and then reproducing it in answer sheets. But are there other learning skills which are necessary for the robust learning of history? And I'm talking about observation. I'm talking about connecting the dots between various disparate pieces of evidence, right? And is there a place for skills like that in the learning of history? So would you like to comment on that?
Absolutely. I mean, just being able to read primary sources critically, being able to understand that there's a subjectivity involved, not just in the person who's creating a historical text, but also the person who's reading it 1,000 years later, right? As Vikramjit was saying a little earlier, the fact that we don't know a single objective history isn't something that's obvious to school kids, because if you're taught that, okay, if you write this, you're going to get marks in an exam, you start to believe that that is history. If your parents tell you that, hey, this is what, if you repeat this as history, then we're going to give you sweets at Diwali, you're going to believe that that is history. So understanding that there is a lot of critical thinking that is necessary, and having that as part of the curriculum and the examination would, I think, really boost learning outcomes for students who study.
I think there are some answers there for Ranjini Chandran then on that question.
I want to add something to this, Ashwin. It's actually easier to say because this is something that I've been struggling with for so many years now, that what should be the examination pattern. And when you have 40, 50 students in your class who all think in different way, and the most creative thing you can do is you can ask them to interpret a certain event in history in their own ways. So either they write down everything, and then if there are 50 students writing and you have to conduct an examination where not just 50 but probably 300 or 500 papers a single teacher has to check, it becomes very difficult to actually do that entire, go through that entire process. So it is not just what ideally should be done. Right now we have to find a middle way between the logistical solution, that the logistics that we have. So one teacher catering to 300 students or 200 students, and Chitra ma'am would understand that perfectly, because teaching in a university is not an easy thing. And then everybody creatively thinking, writing pages and pages of their own views, it becomes a challenge for teacher also. And we don't have that many teachers who can actually cater to all the students that we have in India. So we have problem at both ends.
We have a problem at both ends. All right, wise words. All right, so I think we've spent some time looking at the audience questions. So we're moving now into the end segment of our panel discussion, really. But before we sign off, I have two questions, and I'm going to ask each question to two of you. So let me start with perhaps Reena. So if you had a magic wand, what would you change about how Indians consume history and heritage?
I was brought up in Agra. I was born and brought up in Agra. And I remember that every weekend my parents would take me to monuments, and I have run around those, at the Taj. I remember, I can still feel that where there was shade, the marble would be ice cold, and where there was sun, the marble would be very hot. If I had a magic wand, I would transport, I think, every child to the various monuments and just take them around and let them feel the ambience and touch and just, walk in the footsteps of the people who walked there. That would be such a wonderful experience for each one of them, and a bigger history lesson than anything else, I think.
Thank you. So Vikramjit, I'm going to ask you the same question. If you had a magic wand, what would you change in how the young generation today is consuming history and heritage?
Well, Reena ma'am has already answered. One thing I would really want to do is, I would love if every child of India can speak at least 10 to 12 Indian languages. Half of our culture we will understand, and we will start loving each other if we can only understand each other's language. That will solve most of our fights.
All right. So we need a spell for that now. We've got to come up with a spell for that. But very interesting thought, Vikram. Thank you for that. So the second question I have, and I'll possibly go with Aniruddh first, is many of our young viewers out there could quite possibly be future heritage communicators. So what, in your view, Aniruddh, are the three most important qualities which they should look to nurture in their craft?
That's a great question. I would say the first and most important thing would actually be empathy. Being able to put yourself in the footsteps of historical figures who would have experienced the heritage that you're trying to communicate, and also understanding the perspective that the people that you're communicating with are going to be coming at, I think is the single most useful skill that I found, at least in my work as a history communicator. The second thing I think would be just critical thinking and understanding that there is a lot of subjectivity involved, as I said earlier, in the creation and in the interpretation of historical texts. And by texts, I don't just mean shastras and sutras, but also physical monuments and what they mean to people. Those, I think, would be the single two biggest things. I am not sure that I could really think of a third off the top of my head.
Okay, that was just a trick question of getting you to name three, but I think two will do fine. So empathy and critical thinking, you say. Dr. Chitra, three things you think future heritage communicators should build in their arsenal?
Certainly, they should come with a lot of passion. they should keep building up on that passion, and that's the basis. And then, I think he has voiced everything that I wanted to say. So yes, it comes with a lot of passion and the ability to make things interesting. That's all it boils down to. You put it across in such a way that the written word or the spoken word, whatever it is that you do, capture the minds of the audience, young and old. You need to do that. And to want to do that, you have to work on it.
Passion,
you have to keep thinking about it.
And I would say creativity, but also perhaps staying power. I think making some of this a lifelong labor of love, I think is a very crucial part of the puzzle as well. And what one can achieve in perhaps a very short term is not really what one should be looking to do. I think the willingness to spend time to stay invested in this and not look for quick and immediate results, perhaps that's something to think about as well. All right, so that brings us to the end of the panel, and I would like to thank the panelists profusely for being such a patient and generous participants. I think what you all have provided for by one, the sharing of your experiences, but also your willingness to take on these questions is something which is both intellectually inspiring, but at the same time also provides a lot of food for thought on this larger question which we're exploring, taking old India to young Indians. I also want to thank Tamil Heritage Trust, THT, for setting up this most excellent platform and for also coming up with this really timely topic of discussion. And of course, I would be amiss if I didn't thank the audience for bringing in all these questions with all their enthusiasm. And not all of the questions were very easy. Some of them were quite difficult and with no clear answers at all. So thank you so much for being such an active and enthusiastic audience. So in terms of end words, I would think it would only be fair to say that we end this evening with a few answers, perhaps, many more questions than what we started out with, and much to think about the role that history has to play in our daily lives. And I think it is time well spent, and I'm really hoping that we can have more such fora where we have open-ended, serious, yet at the same time, conversations where one can both speak but also listen. So on that note, I would like to thank all our panelists once again. Thank you very much for being a part of Tamil Heritage Trust's Indology Festival, and we hope you will continue your association with us. To everyone, I would like to say good night and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.